This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman as we continue to look at Iran's attack on 2 Iraqi military bases that house U.S. and Iraqi troops, firing 22 missiles at the bases. No casualties reported. Iran described the attack as revenge for the U.S. assassination of Iranian commander Qassem Soleimani at the Baghdad International Airport last week. We go now to the University of Michigan, to Professor Juan Cole, who teaches history there. His blog and forum Comment is online at juancole.com, the author of many books, including Muhammad, Prophet of Peace Amid the Clash of Empires. Your response to the Iranian attacks on the Iraqi bases that house U.S. and Iraqi troops, and then, of course, before that, the assassination of Soleimani.
Well, both the assassination of General Soleimani and the Iranian response are unprecedented in the past 40 years of tension between the United States and Iran. In fact, the assassination of General Soleimani is unprecedented in general. I lived through the Cold War, and never do I remember the United States assassinating a Soviet general. The two countries were involved in very serious proxy wars and great tensions, but it never went to the point where they would just murder each other's high officials. So this is, I think, something that would only be done by an extremely erratic person such as Donald Trump. This is not a normal piece of statecraft. And that it would elicit an enormous response from Iran was predictable. The response that came, however, did surprise me, because Iran has not tended to act in a direct and open fashion against its enemies. In recent years, it has tended to have a certain degree of deniability in anything that it did. It still hasn't been absolutely determined that Iran itself struck the Abqaiq refinery in Saudi Arabia in September. There have been tanker attacks that, again, haven't been directly tied to Iran, although Iran is under suspicion for them. So I had expected that Iran would work through proxies and try to avoid having a direct fingerprint on this response, that they fired missiles at bases where U.S. personnel were present, even though they appear to have gone out of their way to avoid any casualties, either Iraqi or American, at least symbolically takes this conflict between the two countries to a much higher level. It's spiraling, it's escalating in very worrisome ways.
What do you think will at this point happen? Today, President Trump expected to address the nation.
The two countries at this point have, several choices before them. One would be to leave it at that. There was an assassination, there was a response. The two have been involved in a lot of covert actions against one another. They could go back to doing that, or it could escalate. President Trump could order missile strikes on facilities of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, in which case I presume there would be an Iranian response to that as well. So the other, these are the two possibilities that are before us, either finding a way to turn to diplomacy and stand down, or to escalate.
I wanted to turn to the U.S. Defense Secretary Mark Esper speaking Tuesday.
As we defend our people and interests, let me reiterate that the United States is not seeking a war with Iran, but we are prepared to finish one. We are seeking a diplomatic solution. But first, this will require Iran to de-escalate. It will require the regime to come to the table with the goal of preventing further bloodshed. And it will require them to cease their malign activities throughout the region. As I've said, we are open to having this discussion with them, but we are just as prepared to deliver a forceful response to defend our interests.
Juan Cole, your response to the U.S. Secretary of Defense.
Well, I just find it very difficult to take this sort of discourse from the Trump administration seriously. They killed one of the high-ranking generals of another country, and then they said they did that to avoid a war, or that now is the time for de-escalation. I mean, what world do they live in? This is extremely erratic behavior, and the fact that someone who's relatively level-headed like Mark Esper is going along with it is extremely alarming. I think that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff should simply have resigned rather than go forward with this attack on Soleimani, which was clearly illegal. The Prime Minister of Iraq, who everybody in the U.S. press and among the political class is completely ignoring. There's a kind of Trump's insistence on a white hierarchy has turned into a white hierarchy of knowledge. So if a brown person says something, it's just not entered into the discourse. Abdul Mahdi made it very clear that he had invited General Soleimani to Iraq to be involved in negotiations between Iran and Saudi Arabia to reduce tensions. Soleimani came on a commercial flight where the manifest is clear. He checked through Baghdad airport with a diplomatic passport, and then Trump just blew him away along with several other people, including a high-ranking Iraqi military official. This is weird, and you know, one can only imagine that it's possible that Trump and Esper and Pompeo and that gang didn't want tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran to be reduced. And that was the reason for the strike. This cover story they gave up that Soleimani was coming to kill Americans is you know, falling down, laughing ridiculous. And
now they just refer to him as a bad guy.
Now and you see major journalists and television anchors talking about him as a bad guy. This is not journalism. This is just war propaganda.
Let me ask you what Garrett Graff, the journalist, tweeted yesterday. He said, reminder that as this crisis escalates, we have no director of national intelligence, no deputy director, no Homeland Security secretary, no deputy secretary, no head of CBP or ICE, no State Department undersecretary of arms control, no assistant secretary for Europe, and no Navy secretary.
The Trump administration is a hollow shell. 6 high Pentagon officials have recently resigned, partially because of Trump's erratic behavior. It's extremely worrisome that a person with, it seems to me clear, personality deficits is the commander-in-chief of the United States, and actually, you know, can launch nuclear weapons. So that he's engaging in this kind of escalation is extremely worrisome. The other thing that the American public is not generally being told, although it sometimes comes out a bit, is that the United States has Iran under a financial blockade of unprecedented proportions. Iran is being sanctioned to a degree that no country has ever been sanctioned in peacetime. In essence, you know, if you drew up a naval blockade to prevent Iran from trading with other countries, that would be an act of war in international law. The Trump administration has done this through financial means. It's gone to Japan, South Korea, India, said you may not deal with Iran. You may not buy Iranian petroleum. So Iran's petroleum receipts have plummeted. That was 70% of their income. From 2.5 million barrels a day to 500,000 barrels a day. The country is being economically strangled, and that is the reason for which we see all of this tension and violence. Trump has been at war with Iran for 19 months.
Can you respond to the contradictory messages from the Pentagon and the White House Monday? The U.S. command in Baghdad issued a memo to the Iraqi government appearing to suggest the U.S. would withdraw U.S. troops from the country. This after the Iraqi Parliament's vote to expel U.S. military forces. But hours later, Defense Secretary Mark Esper said the U.S. is not withdrawing with troops from Iraq.
Well, again, it's just typical Trump administration dysfunction. CENTCOM, the Central Command in the Middle East, knows very well that the United States troops have to leave Iraq now. The Parliament voted, it wasn't an advisory vote. The Parliament voted that the Iraqi government should take steps to expel U.S. troops. And that resolution that Parliament passed was presented to them by the Prime Minister. It was an act of the executive to have the vote. So the Trump administration is trying to depict it as a mere advisory vote. It wasn't. It was a vote of Parliament, and the executive asked for the vote, and will now. And Prime Minister Abdul Mahdi said that he takes the letter from the U.S. military at its face value, which was that the U.S. was preparing to leave. The United States troops can't be in Iraq if the Iraqi government doesn't authorize their presence, because it would open them to lawsuits. Every time they got involved in a firefight, if somebody was killed, those people could haul U.S. troops before an Iraqi judge. They could be executed for murder. So the U.S. troops will have to leave, and I think the Iranian strikes on those bases were partly to encourage the Sunni Arabs and the Kurds, who are dragging their feet on this matter, to agree that the U.S. troops should leave, because they don't want to be in the middle of a crossfire between Iran and the United States.
Well, Juan Cole, I want to thank you for being with us, professor at University of Michigan, speaking to us from Ann Arbor. As we turn now to Ali Kadivar, assistant professor of sociology and international studies at Boston College, grew up in Iran during the Iran-Iraq War, completed his undergraduate and first graduate degree at the University of Tehran, where he was active in the student movement. Your response to the effects of what's happening now, the U.S. assassination of the Iranian commander of Soleimani, now the Iranian attack warning Iraq in advance, no U.S. or Iraqi troop casualties as a result of those attacks. And this all happening after these major anti-government protests, both in Iraq and Iran. What this means for the people of Iran, Professor Kadivar?
I think the hit at General Soleimani was also a hit at Iran's domestic politics, Iran's domestic democratic politics. It can tell us a lot to go on the day before Soleimani was assassinated. So we had this series of protests that happened in December. It was ignited by the hike in petroleum price, but it turned to protests and riots against the Islamic Republic. It's actually very natural to see attacks to banks and buildings when protests are against austerity, or when the protests are spontaneous. There is sociological research and research in political science that documents this, in contrast to what the previous guest, Mr. Marandi, said. And the Iranian regime's response was brutal and very violent. Amnesty International says more than 200 people were killed. Other opposition website, Kalameh, has reported about 400 or 500 people have been killed. What is for sure is that hundreds of people were killed. And this was a big damage to the prestige of the Revolutionary Guards that were involved in the repression of the protesters and the Islamic Republic in general. One day before Soleimani's assassination, the commander of the Revolutionary Guards went to the city of Mahshar in the northwest of Iran. There was a bloody crackdown on protesters in this city. And they were trying to make up for the blood that was shed. They were going to give money to the families of the victim and console their pains. The whole regime was scrambling to explain why the regime had such a violent response. A letter was signed on that day by 100 conservative figures. There have been many letters to Supreme Leader Khamenei or to other officials of the Islamic Republic criticizing the political situation. But what is interesting that this letter was signed by 100 conservative figures. And they warned Mr. Khamenei that with the current approaches that the government has been taking towards Iranian politics, Islamic Republic is in its way of demise. Now, General Soleimani's assassination completely changed the narrative in Iran. There is no conversation ongoing about the protest, no conversation ongoing about the violence that the government used in response to protesters. We see in various videos, it's very clear that the security forces opened fire on civilians that were unarmed. This is very visible in various videos that people uploaded to social media. But then you see someone like Mr. Marandi, who's known to be a mouthpiece for the regime, comes out and says this was just a conspiracy of the foreigners. The narrative has changed. General Soleimani was popular inside Iran because not much discussion can happen inside Iran criticizing Iran's foreign policy and involvement in Iraq and Syria. Soleimani was mostly seen as a national figure, as a defender of Iran's national security, as someone that fought with ISIS. So killing of Soleimani was seen as an act of aggression on the entirety of Iran, not necessarily an act against the Islamic Republic. And that's why we see such a crowd coming out in Soleimani's funeral. It really heightened the nationalist sentiments among Iranians. I don't think all these people came out to show support for the regime. They came to show their support for Iran as a country. But of course, not all that crowd can speak for themselves. So when the crowd goes home, then Iranian officials will come out and claim legitimacy from this big crowd that has been out. This is not anything new in the history of Islamic Republic. Islamic Republic does not allow open and free elections in which the opposition parties can participate. But it's a post-revolutionary regimes. They have had a high capacity in mobilizing their supporters. They can bring their supporters to the street. This funeral was definitely coordinated, but I think all the observers said that this was beyond just some funeral that government orchestrated. Iranians genuinely came out to mourn Soleimani and show their support for the country, but the regime is going to claim this for their regime's legitimacy, which was in trouble because of the violent response to the protests. The conversation has changed. Now criticizing Iran's foreign policy is much harder. Revolutionary Guard has claimed and I think gained more prestige, especially from the attacks they did last night. We hope, all of us hope, that the escalation ends. Soleimani's assassination was a major act of escalation. Last night was escalation. We were all very worried and concerned that where this is going to go. Iranians do not want to see another war. I was born under Iran-Iraq war. I still remember running away from missiles and going to shelters. We know how destructive a war could be. We have seen this once. Iraq have seen this once. And it's very unfortunate that this confrontation between Iran and the United States is happening in Iraq, and Iraqis are paying the price for it. But the more acts of escalation, the more militarization would embolden hardliners in Iran, would bring security forces such as the Revolutionary Guards to the center of the Iranian politics. The Iranian regime,
I want to bring in Florida State Representative Anna Eskamani of Orlando. She is the first Iranian American to be elected to any public office in Florida. Representative Eskamani, I want to thank you for being with us. And I was wondering if you can respond to the latest situation that we've been learning about on the border, as details are emerging about how Border Patrol detained and questioned as many as 200 Iranian Americans at the U.S.-Canada border over the weekend. New York Times reporting some of them were detained for hours, including being interrogated about their opinions on the United States and the situation with Iran. Apparently, many had gone to Vancouver for whole families for a Persian pop concert.
Correct. Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. And I also just want to echo the previous speaker's points around nationalism rising in Iran and how there continues to be a demand for a true democratic government in Iran, but a desire not to go to war. And that is a very big difference between what the people of Iran want right now, based on talking to my family. In regards to the border, we saw this happen in action on social media as families began sharing their stories of being stopped and questioned at the border. And the reality is that when we see the potential war rise in countries like Iran between the United States, we'll see xenophobia rise right here locally. And whether it's through different rhetoric on the internet or state-sanctioned questioning from from customs and border control, it becomes really, really scary and problematic to be an Iranian American in this country. And I was very pleased to see solidarity coming from other Americans standing side by side, those who have been treated this way, and of course members of Congress stepping up to ensure that answers are found on what exactly took place and that justice is served for those who are seeking it.
You've said that Trump's policies have been catastrophic not just for U.S.-Iran relations, but also for any kind of democratic reform within Iran.
It's been very problematic. I mean, I have opposed President Trump's policies from day one. And whether it was the travel ban, which selectively chose Muslim-majority countries, Iran included, making it much more difficult for Iranians to travel to this country, to attend our universities, to engage in American democracy, whether it was the economic warfare through really extreme sanctions, prohibiting even humanitarian needs going to Iran, all the way to the rise of hate crimes in this country, as we're seeing not just with the Iranian Americans, but other groups as well. The reality, too, is that if the Trump administration truly cared about the people of Iran, he wouldn't toss around the idea of attacking cultural sites, which allow the Islamic Republic of Iran to use as propaganda to help build those crowds during these funerals. And so, unfortunately, our president continues to be irresponsible with his rhetoric, lacking complete strategy. And I don't think he and his administration expected this type of reaction from Iran. However, I remain hopeful for de-escalation. It was very scary to watch everything take place last night. But I'm very hopeful that members of Congress will ensure that there is accountability and oversight and that we prevent going to war with Iran.
I want to thank you both for being with us. Florida State Representative Anna Eskamani of Orlando, the first Iranian American to be elected in the state of Florida, and Ali Kadivar, who is assistant professor at Boston College in Boston, Massachusetts. Also Juan Cole, professor of history at University of Michigan. When we come back, we go to Puerto Rico, where 6.4 magnitude earthquake has rocked the island, sparking a massive power outage. We'll go to that in a second.